My wealthy parents tried to marry me off to secure a business merger, so I rejected it and ran off with my true love, and sent them my elopement photo during their company board meeting, and the fallout was nuclear. I, 24F, come from what people would call old money, think country club memberships, charity galas, and the kind of generational wealth where your great-grandfather's business decisions still affect your daily life. My father runs a tech conglomerate that's been in our family for 3 generations, and my mother sits on the boards of half the cultural institutions in our city. Growing up, I always knew I was different from my prep school classmates. While they complained about curfews and allowances, I was getting lectures about family legacy and maintaining our position in society. I thought it was just typical rich parent stuff until I turned 23 and my parents sat me down for what they called a conversation about my future. Turns out, our family business has been hemorrhaging money for the past 5 years. Bad investments, market shifts, and my father's refusal to adapt to changing technology had put us in serious financial trouble. The kind of trouble where we might lose everything: the house, the company, the lifestyle, all of it. But my parents had a solution: the Hartwell family. The Hartwells own a massive tech startup that's been acquiring struggling companies like ours. Thomas Hartwell III, 26M, is the heir apparent, and according to my parents, he's expressed interest in me. A marriage between us would secure a merger that would save our company and elevate both families to even greater heights. When I laughed and said that sounded like something out of the 1800s, my mother's face went ice cold. She said, "Sweetheart, this isn't a request. This is how our world works. Thomas is a nice young man from a good family. You'll learn to care for each other." My father added, "Besides, what else are you going to do? Your art history degree isn't exactly going to support the lifestyle you're accustomed to." I was stunned. I mean, I knew my parents were traditional, but I never thought they'd actually try to arrange my marriage like I was livestock being traded. I told them absolutely not. I was dating someone, Marcus, who I'd met at a coffee shop near the museum where I'd been volunteering. He was a grad student in environmental science, worked part-time as a barista, and was the first person who'd ever made me laugh until my stomach hurt. My parents had never met him because I knew they'd disapprove of his background. My mother's response? "That little coffee boy? Darling, that's just a phase. Thomas can give you stability, influence, a real future." The next few months became a war of attrition. My parents started coincidentally running into the Hartwells at every social event, always making sure Thomas and I ended up seated together or partnered for charity auction bidding. They'd book restaurant reservations and forget to mention Thomas would be joining us. They even arranged for him to be my escort to my cousin's wedding. Thomas, for what it's worth, seemed as uncomfortable with this as I was. He was polite, well-educated, and probably would have been a decent friend under different circumstances. But every conversation felt like a job interview, and I could see him mentally checking boxes. Acceptable small talk, check. Proper etiquette, check. Will photograph well at company events, check. The pressure ramped up when my father started making not-so-subtle threats about my trust fund and inheritance. It would be a shame if poor decisions led to consequences, he'd say whenever I brought up Marcus or refused another casual dinner with the Hartwells. Meanwhile, Marcus had no idea what was happening. I was too embarrassed to explain that my parents were essentially trying to auction me off to save their business. I started making excuses to avoid spending time with him, which led to fights about my priorities and whether I was ashamed of him. The breaking point came at a family dinner where both sets of parents were present. My mother had clearly been drinking, and she started talking about wedding venues and guest lists like everything was already decided. Thomas's mother chimed in about the importance of maintaining bloodlines and how excited she was to have such an accomplished daughter-in-law. I snapped. I stood up and said, "I'm not marrying Thomas. I'm not a business asset. I'm a person, and I get to choose my own life." My father slammed his hand on the table so hard the wine glasses rattled. "You selfish little girl. Do you think this is just about you? This merger affects hundreds of employees, multiple family legacies. Your grandmother is rolling over in her grave." That's when Thomas finally spoke up. "Actually, I don't think this is a good idea either." The silence was deafening. He continued, "I've been going along with this because I thought she was interested, but it's clear she's not. I don't want to marry someone who doesn't want to marry me. That's not fair to either of us." His parents looked mortified. My parents looked murderous. And I felt grateful to Thomas for the first time since this whole nightmare started. But instead of ending things, it just made my parents more desperate. My mother started crying about how I was destroying the family, and my father began making increasingly dramatic threats about cutting me off entirely. That night, I called Marcus and told him everything. I expected him to be angry about the lies and the secrecy, but instead, he just listened quietly. When I finished, he said, "So what do you want to do?" "I want to run away with you," I said, half joking. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." We spent the next 3 weeks planning in secret. Marcus had been accepted to a PhD program at a university across the country, something I hadn't known because I'd been too wrapped up in family drama to ask about his life. We decided to elope and move together. Me finally cutting ties with my toxic family situation, him starting his doctorate, both of us building a life based on what we wanted instead of what other people expected. We drove to a small town 2 states over, got married at a courthouse with a justice of the peace and 2 strangers as witnesses. I wore a sundress I'd bought at Target, the first piece of clothing I'd ever owned that didn't come from a department store my mother approved of. Marcus wore khakis and a button-down shirt he'd ironed in our motel room. It was perfect. It was everything those stuffy charity galas and formal dinners weren't. It was real, and it was ours. We spent our honeymoon week driving across the country, stopping at roadside diners and quirky tourist attractions, talking about everything we wanted to do now that we were free from my family's expectations. Marcus started calling me Mrs. in this goofy voice that made me giggle every time. When we got to his university town, we found a tiny apartment near campus. I got a job at a local art gallery, not glamorous, but I loved being surrounded by creativity every day. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living instead of just performing. For 2 months, I didn't contact my family at all. I figured they needed time to cool off, and honestly, I needed time to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly managing their expectations. But then my younger brother started texting me. At first, it was just casual check-ins, but eventually he told me that the family situation had gotten worse. The Hartwell deal had fallen through entirely after our failed engagement, and now my parents were scrambling to find other investors. My father was having stress-related health problems, and my mother had become obsessed with fixing the family reputation. The guilt was eating me alive. Part of me wondered if I should have just gone through with the marriage to save everyone else's problems. But Marcus reminded me that I couldn't set myself on fire to keep other people warm, and that my parents had created this mess through their own poor business decisions. It wasn't my responsibility to sacrifice my happiness to fix it. Still, I missed my family. Despite everything, I loved them. I wanted them to know I was okay, that I was happy, that their daughter wasn't lost. She was just finally found. That's when I decided to send the photo. I chose our favorite picture from the courthouse, both of us grinning like idiots, my hair slightly messy from the wind, Marcus's tie crooked, both of us holding up our marriage certificate. We looked young and happy and completely in love. It was the opposite of every stiff, formal family photo I'd ever taken. My brother had mentioned that my parents were having an emergency board meeting that afternoon to discuss the company's future with potential investors. I knew they'd have their phones on silent, but they'd check messages during breaks. I sent the photo to our family group chat with a simple message. I wanted you to know that I'm happy, I'm safe, and I'm loved. This is my husband Marcus. We got married 2 months ago. I hope someday you can be happy for us. Then I turned off my phone and went to work. When I checked it 6 hours later, I had 73 missed calls and 156 text messages. My mother's first message, sent 3 minutes after I'd sent the photo. What is this? Followed immediately by, call me right now. Then, how could you do this to us during the most important meeting of our lives? My father's messages were more restrained, but somehow more cutting. I hope you understand what you've thrown away. This family gave you everything. Don't expect us to support your mistakes. But the worst was from my grandmother, who rarely texted. I am deeply disappointed in the woman you've chosen to become. My brother, though, sent, holy shit, you look so happy. Tell me everything. And my cousin wrote, good for you for choosing love over money. Half the family is having meltdowns, but I think you're brave as hell. Apparently, my mother had been in the bathroom when she'd seen my message and had started crying so loudly that my father had to leave the board meeting to check on her. When the potential investors asked what was wrong, my father had to explain that there was a family emergency, which led to questions about family stability and whether the company's problems extended beyond just financial issues. The deal they'd been negotiating fell through that afternoon. My parents blamed me entirely. The voicemails ranged from heartbroken, how could you do this to us, to furious, you've destroyed everything this family worked for, to manipulative, your father is having chest pains from the stress. For a few days, I felt terrible. I wanted to share my happiness with them, not torpedo their business meeting. But Marcus pointed out that their reaction said everything about their priorities. Instead of congratulating their daughter on finding love, they were angry that my happiness had interfered with their business dealings. The family drama continued for weeks. Some relatives took my parents' side, sending me messages about family loyalty and responsibility. Others supported my choice, saying they'd always thought the arranged marriage idea was archaic and wrong. My aunt called to tell me that my parents had hired a private investigator to check Marcus's background and were apparently shocked to discover that he was exactly who he said he was. A graduate student from a middle-class family with no criminal record or hidden agenda. They seemed almost disappointed that they couldn't find anything to use against him. The most surreal part came when my mother sent me a formal invitation to Thomas Hartwell's engagement party. He'd gotten engaged to someone else, a woman he'd actually chosen himself, and my parents were attending to maintain social connections. The pettiness was almost impressive. But slowly, things started to shift. My brother visited us for a weekend and spent hours talking to Marcus about environmental policy and sustainable technology. He went back and told my parents that Marcus was actually really smart and that I seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. My grandmother, who I'd always been close to, sent a carefully worded letter saying that while she didn't approve of how I'd handled things, she wanted me to know that I'd always have a place in the family if I chose to return. The real breakthrough came when my father had what my mother dramatically called a health scare, but was actually just a panic attack brought on by stress. While he was in the hospital overnight for observation, I called my mother. I know you're angry, I said. And I know you think I destroyed everything. But I'm your daughter, and I love you, and I just want you to know that I'm okay. She cried for 10 minutes straight. When she finally stopped, she said, I just don't understand why you couldn't trust us. We only wanted what was best for you. What was best for me, or what was best for the company? Long pause. I thought they were the same thing, she admitted quietly. We talked for 2 hours. Really talked, maybe for the first time since I was a child. She told me about her own mother pressuring her to marry my father for social status, how she'd convinced herself it was love, but had never been sure. She talked about the fear of losing everything they'd built, the shame of potential bankruptcy, the pressure from my father's side of the family to do something about the business problems. I told her about Marcus, about how he made me laugh, about the tiny apartment we'd painted together, about the job at the gallery where I was learning to curate exhibitions, about how for the first time in my life, I felt like I was living authentically instead of performing a role. Are you happy? She asked finally. Really, truly happy, I said. Then I suppose that's what matters, she said, though I could tell it was hard for her to say it. The company did end up filing for bankruptcy 6 months later. My parents lost the house, the country club memberships, most of their social status. But instead of the dramatic crash I'd expected, they seemed almost relieved. My father took a job as a consultant for tech companies, making a fraction of what he used to but working reasonable hours for the first time in decades. My mother started volunteering at a literacy nonprofit and discovered she was actually passionate about education policy. They moved to a modest house in the suburbs and, according to my brother, started talking to each other more than they had in years. Marcus and I visited them for Christmas, 8 months after the elopement photo incident. It was awkward at first. My mother kept apologizing for the house not being what I was used to, and my father made several stiff comments about Marcus, taking care of his investment, meaning me. But by the end of the weekend, my mother was showing Marcus her volunteer work and asking his opinion about environmental education programs. My father and I had a long conversation about art and whether my gallery experience might translate to business consulting for creative firms. It wasn't perfect, and probably never would be. But it was real in a way our family interactions had never been before. The weirdest epilogue to this whole story? Thomas Hartwell reached out to me through LinkedIn a year later. He'd seen an article about an exhibition I'd curated and wanted to congratulate me. We ended up having coffee when he was in town for business, and he told me that our broken engagement had actually been the best thing that ever happened to him. I was so focused on doing what my parents expected that I never stopped to think about what I actually wanted, he said. When you stood up to everyone, it made me realize I could too. He'd married a woman he'd met at a book club, a teacher who had no connection to his family's business world. His parents had been disappointed initially, but came around when they realized how happy he was. I should thank you, he said. You saved us both from a miserable marriage. Now, 2 years later, Marcus is finishing his PhD. I'm the assistant curator at a contemporary art museum, and we live in a house we actually chose together. We're not wealthy by my family's old standards, but we're building something that's entirely ours. My parents still don't completely understand my choices, but they've stopped trying to change them. My mother sends me articles about art exhibitions, and my father asks Marcus about his research. It's not the relationship I grew up thinking we'd have, but it's honest in a way it never was before. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just gone along with the arranged marriage. Would the business have been saved? Would my parents still have their old life? Would everyone have been happier? But then Marcus comes home from the lab excited about some breakthrough in renewable energy, or I discover an incredible new artist for our next show, and I remember that choosing authenticity over expectation was the best decision I ever made. The wedding photo is framed on our mantle now, not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a reminder that sometimes the scariest thing you can do is choose your own happiness. And honestly, I regret nothing.